Okay, so welcome everyone. Tonight we are going to, Bezrat Hashem, learn 2 chapters in 70 Faces. The first will be about what's called extra words in the text. This is chapter 15. We finished the section of letters, and now we're starting the section of words. So the first part of the class will be on extra words. In other words, when a word is doubled or there is a redundancy in the verse, extra words are there that, in a sense, on the surface don't need to be there. So inevitably, the sages are going to comment on this because the general principle is there is no extra letter in the Torah or extra word. If it's there to tell us something. And even though it may appear to be extra, really what it's telling us that there's an extra meaning that needs to be emphasized here. And then the second part of the class, we're going to do what's called milui. Milui comes from the word to fill out. When we get there, I'll explain what that means. When words are spelled in their full form. And that we'll get to. So we're going to start, again, for those who have the book and want to see where we're doing it, it's on page 142. And this is from the opening verse of the Parsha of Toldot, where it says, Eila Toldot, Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holid Yitzchak. So in English, these are the generations of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. Avraham gave birth, really Sarah, but Avraham gives birth to Yitzchak. So the obvious question is, if the beginning of the verse says Yitzchak, the son of Avram, then we know that Avram gave birth to Yitzchak. Why do we have to have this redundancy? So what appears to be redundancy is pointing out, it's one of many examples, but it's one of the primary examples of the principle called inter-inclusion. This is absolutely one of the most important ideas in Kabbalah and Hasidut, is the idea that in every thing or entity is contained everything else that's connected to it. The primary example that we have is Sfirat HaOmer, where we count 7 weeks, and each week represents one of the Sfirot. But it's not like the whole first week is Chesed. It's Chesed Sheba Chesed, Gevura Sheba Chesed, Tiferet Sheba Chesed, and onward. In other words, all 7 of the lower Sfirot are contained in all the other 7. This is what's called inter-inclusion. So this verse that we're speaking about, Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, Abraham gave birth to Yitzchak, is actually describing a archetypal inter-inclusion that happened between them throughout their life, but especially at the Akedah, at what's called the binding of Yitzchak. Avram is known as Chesed. Yitzchak is known as Gevura. Avram is loving kindness, and Yitzchak is strength, judgment, the opposite of outgoing. He's more ingoing. He's more introverted. Avram is extroverted. And what we're told, in short, is at the Akedah, there was this incredible transference of energies from one to the other, because it was a test for both of them. Even though in the Torah, it says that this was a test. It says God came and tested Avram. According to tradition, this is the 10th test of Avram, the kind of like the climax of all of his tests. But it's obvious that it's also a test for Yitzchak. I mean, it's Yitzchak who's being tied to the altar, and at least it appeared that he would be offered up. So obviously for Yitzchak, this takes an enormous amount of gevura to allow himself to be bound to the altar. And for Avram, it was the test of chesed. How is he going to sacrifice his son? So paradoxically, Avram also wants to fulfill what at least he thinks is the will of God. The directive is, that's what God told him to do. So Avram had to have tremendous gevura in order to go through this test. And Yitzchak, in his love for his father and his love for God, he demonstrates chesed. So each one of them, in a sense, transfers to the other their main characteristic. Avram transfers to Yitzchak chesed, and Yitzchak transfers to Avram gevura. Now, this wasn't happening necessarily on a conscious level, but it was happening on a deep, supraconscious level. So we're told that that's the redundancy here is that Yitzchak is the son of Abraham, meaning that Yitzchak took upon himself to absorb and to integrate his father's midah, his father's characteristic. And Avram gave birth to Yitzchak, but in himself, he was able to give birth to gevura within himself. So this is a classic example of what's called hit kalalut, inter-inclusion. And this is really happening all over the Torah, because without inter-inclusion, we see the Torah as being one-dimensional. We see it as very black and white. If you can't inter-include things one in the other, then you're seeing the world in a very dualistic, bipolar kind of fashion. And so here, what looks like extra words really is pointing out something incredibly deep here. Now, I'm just going to point out that Avram is the epitome of chesed. His tent is open on all four sides. He's feeding the whole world. He's teaching the whole world. He even interrupts a revelation of God because he sees three strangers coming and says, "Master of the world, if you don't mind, I have some guests to take care of. I'll get back to you." So he's the epitome of chesed, but to pass all of these 10 tests actually took tremendous gevura, the very opposite of what we usually think of his midah. And when we look at Yitzchak, Yitzchak is the introverted strength of gevura, and yet the word love is associated with Yitzchak more than any other character. It says that Yitzchak loved his wife. It says he loved his son. And it says about Avram that he loved Yitzchak. So Yitzchak actually is all about love. And everyone asks, why was he so lacking with discipline with Esav? is because he really absorbed the chesed of his father. You would think that Yitzhak, who's Gevura, when he sees Esav going off the path, he would be full of rebuke. Instead, he's constantly trying to draw him in, so much so that he wants to give him the blessing with the hope that it will bring him back to the fold. He had tremendous chesed. So here's just an example how Avram absorbed the gevura of Yitzchak, and Yitzchak absorbed the chesed of Abraham. So that is our first example of what appear to be extra words. Now the next one is on page 143, and this is about sanctifying the new moon. In the old days, before there was a set calendar, so there was a very elaborate ritual of witnesses coming to the high court, the Sanhedrin, and declaring, bearing witness that they had seen the new moon. And then it was the job of the Sanhedrin to publicly declare the new moon. So it says in the Gemara that it wasn't just the Sanhedrin that would say it is sanctified, meaning they made a declaration. That declaration set that day to be the new moon of the particular month, Rosh Chodesh. But the sages learn out that the people also had to say it is sanctified. So the question is, where did they learn that? And so there is a verse in Leviticus 23:2 that has what appears to be an extra word. In fact, even grammatically, it's a little clumsy. In English, it's speak to the children of Israel and say to them, God's appointed holy days that you shall designate as holy occasions, these they, my appointed holy days. So the word these they is like, why do you need both of these words? And so the sages understood if there's a word there that seems extra, it must be telling us something. Not just as a drasha, not just as like a fancy extra meaning, but the halacha, what the halacha is. And so because it's these, they, so they understood that the they were the people who were coming to bear witness that they had seen the new moon. And so the Sanhedrin would say it is sanctified. And the people also, based on this one extra word, would also say it is sanctified. So this is an example, but I just want to point out a very, very basic idea here is that Shabbos, no one declares when Shabbos happens. Shabbos, in a sense, happens automatically. Every seventh day is Shabbat. You don't need the Sanhedrin to declare it. You don't need the people to declare it. It's up to each person whether they observe it, but it doesn't need a public declaration. The holidays do, though. And all of the holidays are dependent on the new moon. And that's why, believe it or not, Hanukkah wasn't that long ago. Seems like way in the past, but only like 2 weeks ago, it was still Hanukkah. One of the three mitzvot that the Greeks forbade the Jews from observing was declaring the new moon. Why? Because if you don't know when the new moon is, you don't know when the holiday of that month will turn out. By declaring the new moon, then you know when Yom Kippur is, when Sukkot is, when Pesach is, when Shavuos. It's all dependent on the new moon. And so the Greeks wanted to wipe that out and like confuse all of the holy days. So this idea of declaring the new moon is God put it into our hands. So this is like really an amazing idea, is that God said, here are your holy days, but ultimately you have to determine when they will be. So this goes along with a very important concept that God made the Jewish people partners in not just fulfilling the Torah, but in the establishment and the running of the world by giving over the power into our hands to declare when the new moon is, and thereby establishing the whole calendar. And we'll remember that the very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people was HaChodesh Hazeh Lechem. This month is the first of the months of the year for you. And that was in preparation of leaving Egypt. So the very first mitzvah we get is how to calculate the Jewish calendar. That's how important it is. So I'm just mentioning that because here we're learning about the sage is learning from one extra word that the people also have to declare it. So it's not just in the hands of the high court, but it's really in the hands of the whole people to declare the new moon. The next one is a very, very short one, and that's on the bottom of 143. But this is one of the most famous verses in the whole Torah, is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the verse ends, I am God. So everyone asks, why does it have to say, I am God at the end of this mitzvah? There's 613 mitzvot in the Torah. Not every one of them ends, I am God. Why in this case, when actually the whole verse is, I'll read it in English, is, you shall neither take revenge from nor bear a grudge against the members of your people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am God. The famous part of the verse is really only half of the verse. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am God. So Rashi, in a different place, explains that when it says, I am God in relationship to a mitzvah, means I am faithful to pay a reward. And I am faithful to fulfill my promises. So here, we're learning that there's something very, very important about this verse. And the way it's explained in Chassidut is that this is a teaching from Rav Ginsburg. He teaches that just like there are soulmates between people, husband and wife, there's also a level of soulmate between Rebbe and student, Rebbe and disciple. But Rav Ginsburg teaches also there's soulmates between verses. There's certain verses that are written in a way that they have another verse in the Tanakh that is its soulmate. So what is the soulmate of you shall love your neighbor as yourself? It's you shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. In the first passage of the Shema that we read twice a day. So they're like soulmates. Loving other people and loving God is like soulmates. So it's explained in Chassidut that at the end of this verse, it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am God, to teach us, if you want to love God, love your neighbor. And by loving your neighbor, you are actually fulfilling loving God. So they're soulmates. Okay, the next example is one that everyone talks about. This is on the bottom of page 147, is the longest parsha in the Torah is Parsha Naso. It's a second parsha in the book of Numbers. 176 verses, the longest in the entire Torah. And the reason that it's the longest is the last part, which is very lengthy, describes the gifts that the princes of the tribes brought on the day that the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was dedicated in the temple. And each one brought gifts, and it goes through and it names who the prince was and on what day. There were 12 days of like part of the process of dedicating the tabernacle. But the amazing thing is, when you read it, the gifts that they bring are exactly the same. Exactly the same. And it's very lengthy. It has to go through all 12 princes. And the obvious question is, the Torah could have said, in theory, could have said, these are the gifts that the princes of the 12 tribes brought for the dedication of the tabernacle. And then it could even have named them in one verse, just like in this week's Parsha. In the beginning, the 12 tribes, the sons of Jacob, are named one after the other. So why so many verses to explain the very same gifts? So one answer is, and it's a very, very important answer, actually an extremely important answer, is that, and there's a midrash that goes through and explains that even though the gifts were exactly the same, the intent of each one of the princes was completely different. Let's say, for example, they all brought a goat, but each one of the 12 tribes had a different reason, a different intent, a different thought of why they were bringing that goat. So why is this so important? Is that the example I'm going to pick, but it could be expanded, is every day we say the same prayers, the same Sukkah de Zimra, verses of praise, the same Shema, the same Amida, the standing prayer. And so if we don't have a different intent every day, we would ask, well, what's the point? I mean, we're saying the same words day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And so in the Torah, by going through the 12 princes and showing that even though the gifts were the same, each of the princes was a different person. Each one of the tribes had a different energy. And therefore they could approach the same, let's call it seemingly objective reality with a completely different subjective perspective of that reality. Or example, 100 people are at the same event or in the same place. And whatever it is, I'll pick one. Going to the Western Wall, going to the Kotel in Jerusalem. You have 100 people standing at the wall, And everyone has, truthfully, a completely different experience. They're at the same wall at the same time, and yet each one is going to have a completely different experience. So, some people might have a similar experience. Or let's say you have 10,000 people at a concert, and they're hearing the same music, they're seeing the same musicians on stage, but each one's thought process is completely different. So this is one of the answers, because this is probably the most extreme example of extra words in the whole Tanakh, is why you have so many words to describe the same gifts. But the lesson we can learn from this is incredibly important. Now, the next one is just really an amazing one on page 149. In Hebrew, there is a word, aleph tav, and it is a particle that identifies a direct object in a sentence. There's no translation for it. It's untranslatable. It's just part of, let's call it grammar. It's just part of grammar in Hebrew. On the surface, it is just introducing a direct object. So there was one of the sages, he took it upon himself to, this is in the Gemara in Pesachim, he took it upon himself to go through every verse in the 5 books of Moses in the Chumash and give a reason why this verse has this et, aleph tav in it, even though it has a grammatical function, but along with our general principle that there's no extra words in the Torah. So why do you have to have all of these ets? Aleph tav. So he went through and he found a reason for every single tav except one. And there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of this 2-letter word. He came up with a reason for everyone except one. And so he told his students that I'm canceling all of the reasons for all the other ones because I couldn't find a reason for this one. And the students were like incredulous. It was like, you're going to cancel your ideas for all the other ones because of this one that you can't find? And so he said to them, he said, just like I would get a reward for finding a reason for every one of them, I will also get reward for removing my explanations because of this one. But then Rabbi Akiva came along and he gave a reason for this one that the other sage couldn't find. And it's on the verse that you shall revere God, your God. And he explained why the word et. So he said, and this is such an important idea, he said, with the same reverence that you have for God, you should give that same type of reverence to your teacher, to your Rebbe. And so he completed all of the ets in the Torah. So here's a classic example of that. Even a word that you can't translate, it seems to have no intrinsic meaning, except that that's how Hebrew grammar works. The sages, between both of them were able to find a reason for every single one of them. Every single one of them. Okay, so now we're going to go to the second part. And this is called milui. This is called milui, means filling. So I'm going to hold up the book here and try to explain so everyone will understand here. So, and milui means you have a letter, aleph. And this is one of, let's say, 3 or 4 letters in a word. But when you fill out the aleph, this is how you spell aleph. Aleph, lamed, pei. That's how you spell aleph. So the idea of milui is if you have a word, and this is especially used in gematria, in numerical values. So let's say a word has a numerical value of just, let's say, the 3 or 4 letters in the word. But now what happens if you fill, this is called milui, you fill out the letters, and so all of a sudden the 3 letters become 8 or 9 or 10 letters. Then you calculate the numerical value of that, and then you get like what's called the deeper meaning of the original word by filling it out. So here you start with a letter, and then you spell out the letter. But now you have aleph, lamed, pei. So here, aleph, lamed, pei. Now you're filling it out another time. And then you fill it out another time. Aleph, lamed, pei. Lamed, mem, daled, pei, hey. Now this seems all like, whoa, where are we going here? What's the purpose of this? But I'm going to explain in a way that we really can understand. It's like putting something under a microscope. In other words, I'm going to take my hand. So everyone sees my hand. This is like a letter. Now, what happens if I put it under a microscope? All of a sudden, I will see the cells of the skin. And let's say I up the, what is it called when the measurement of the microscope, and all of a sudden you can see into an individual cell and everything that's in there. Then if you up it up again, you could see the atoms in the cells. So I'll never forget the first time I magnification. Thank you, Shoshana. Thank you. Magnification. The first time I saw this was in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Now, since then, there are many similar kinds of videos online. But what it was, because Chicago is on Lake Michigan. So they started with a picture of a person lying on a blanket at the beach of Lake Michigan. That's all you could see in the picture. And then, like, as it were, the drone went up, and then you could see the whole beach. And all of a sudden, this person who was on the blanket is one of many people on the beach. And then it went up again, and all of a sudden you see the whole state of Illinois. And just in the corner, that's where the beach is. And it keeps on going up, and then you see the whole United States, and you see the whole world. Then you see the whole Milky Way, and then you see many different galaxies. And then it went in reverse. It went back down. And then it focused on his hand. That's why I remember the hand. And then it went the same amount of magnifications inside. And the amazing thing is, when you got to like thousands of galaxies, it looked exactly the same as the inside of an atom with all the space between the particles. It looked exactly the same. So I'm saying all of this. I'm saying all of this to explain how the Arizal used Milui, not only him, but he did this extensively, and he began to explore the deeper meanings that are not on the surface. It's only when you put it under the microscope and you magnify it. So that's what Milui is. And because, again, without that explanation, it's like, well, what do we need all of this filling out for? But it's showing deeper and deeper meanings. So we're going to learn now a few of them. So the first one is, this is from Rav Ginsburg. And he says like this, that the expression Yehi Or, Vayehi Or, let there be light, and there was light. So he points out that when you take those words and you fill out the letters, Yehi Or, Vayehi Or, and you fill them out the way I showed you. So the filling letters equals 1370. What is 1370? So Rav Ginsburg explains it's 137 times 10. The idea in Kabbalah is any word that is multiplied by 10 is its fuller manifestation. So what's the importance of 137? So 137 is considered today the most important number in quantum physics. Why? Why is that? And please don't expect me to explain the deeper meanings of this, but I can tell you that the number 137, or 1 over 137, is what's called the inverse of the fine structure constant. What is the inverse of the fine structure constant? It characterizes the strength of the electromagnetic force affecting charged particles. In other words, in our reality of the four forces of the universe, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, well, these are ones that hold the world together, but we're not aware of them. The other two we are, electromagnetic and gravity. We're very aware of gravity, and we're very aware the whole world works on electromagnetic energy. And so this fine structure constant is what Rav Ginsburg calls the coupling feature that is balancing all the particles of the universe are in measure to this number of 137. So I just want to point out that Rav Ginsburg wrote an entire book called 137, The Riddle of Creation. And it's I don't know, 400 pages on this number. what it means in science and what it means in the Torah. And so since the whole idea of the inverse of the fine structure constant has to do with electromagnetic, so he points out the idea that these words, yehi or, vayehi or, in other words, the first manifestation of electromagnetic energy in the Torah is 10 times this number. So this is obviously a new revelation, but of course that's the function of oral Torah. A couple centuries ago or a couple millennium ago, people did not know about this relationship or this ratio of 1/137. But the general principles were there, waiting to be discovered. Now, this idea of the coupling function of this number is very, very important, because a very important word in the Torah equals 137, and that is Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah equals 137. So you'll say, okay, that's nice. What does that have to do with the fine structure? The inverse of the fine structure constant. But because this number is the relationship between the electromagnetic energy and individual particles, between photons and electrons, it's the correspondences between them, because that's what Kabbalah means. Kabbalah we usually translate as to receive, lekabel, to receive, the received mystical tradition. But the verb kuf bet lamed means to make correspondences. That's what it means. And where do we see this? We see this in the tabernacle, where we made curtains. And this is all in the Torah itself, in the written text. And on the seam of one side of the curtain were placed 50 loops. And on the other seam were 50 clasps. And then the Torah said 50 is very significant, of course, all the numbers in the Mishkan, the 50 gates of understanding. The Torah says you should make a direct correspondence between each clasp and the loop. That's how the word kabel is used in the Torah, not as to receive, but to make correspondences. And so it says that, and then you put the curtains together, and then it says v'haya hamishkan echad. And then the whole tabernacle became one. Because when you put the curtains together, that's the outer courtyard. But that is what unified the space called the tabernacle. And it was all done through these correspondences of the 50 clasps and the 50 loops. And so Rav Ginsburg says that is the function of Kabbalah, is learning to see how everything corresponds one thing to another until the Haya Mishkan Echad, until the whole Mishkan becomes one. And so that's why, until I said this, maybe people are thinking, well, okay, Yehi or Vayihir, or is 10 times 137, what, and Kabbalah, what does it have to do? But if you follow what I'm saying, the function of this inverse of the fine structure constant is in nature and science exactly what Kabbalah is to the spiritual worlds. But of course, it's the same language. No, excuse me. It's a different language saying the same thing. So this is like, it's a pretty way out explanation, but when you really think about it, it's very profound, extremely profound. Okay, the next one is a very, very beautiful one. That's on page 152, is one of the classic stories in the Torah of love, of course, is between Yaakov and Rachel. Yaakov, when he meets Rachel, it's classic story. There's a few others like this of love at first sight. The first time Yitzchak and Rivka see each other, there's also this immediate connection. Even though it was full of problems when David meets Bathsheba, it was problematic, but there was an immediate recognition that they were soulmates. But maybe the most classic one is when Yaakov meets Rachel. And he goes to her and he kisses her and he cries. And then he offers, it's not like Lavan, Rachel's father, demanded this. Yaakov said, I'll work 7 years for Rachel's hand in marriage. And then the Torah says that the time flew because of his great love for Rachel. So this is just such a classic. So this is also from Rav Ginsburg. He points out that if you take the names Yaakov and Rachel and you calculate the milui of their names, it equals 1750. And that equals one of the verses in Shir HaShirim, which is how fair and how pleasant you are, a love with delights. And actually, this verse is a good part of the inspiration for my naming my commentary on the Chumash, the Orchard of Delights. So this is one of the verses from Shir HaShirim that motivated me or inspired me to call my commentary Orchard of Delights. Is that with this, it's a love of delights. Our love of learning Torah should be a delight to us. That's like the best word, more than just intellectual or even emotional. It's just a delight. It transcends any real box. It's just, wow. It's just a delight. Okay, now the next one has a very practical connection, and that's on page 153, that the name, we know that God has many names in the Torah, and one of them is Kel Shaddai, or El Shaddai. This is one of the names of God. It's associated with the sphere of Yesod. And we're told that Yesod is always connected to sexual energy. It could be for not the good, but obviously it's meant for the good. The idea of being fruitful and multiplying. But more than that, it's the deep connection between people. The Yesod is the foundation between people, is bringing them together. And so when you take this name of God and you calculate the filling in of the letters of this name, it equals 500. And what's the significance of 500? It is exactly the gematria of Peru Uravu. Be fruitful and multiply. And you'll see in the Chumash, this name of God used many, many times. In almost every single time, in the simple, literal understanding of why is this name being used more than a different name of God. In almost all of them, it's connected to being fruitful and multiplying. And that's why the verse that I chose here from Bereshit 35:11 is, and God said to him, meaning to Yaakov, this is when Yaakov is returning to Israel after 20 years out of Israel, and he's returning now with his wives and children. So God came to him and said, I am Almighty God with this name, Kel Shakai, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a multitude of nations shall come into existence from you, and kings shall come forth from your loins. But this is not the only time. Many times in the Chumash, this name is used specifically with blessings of being fruitful and multiplying. So the amazing thing is when you calculate the filling in of this name, it equals, in Hebrew, Peru Uravu. Now, I'm going to take it one other step that is not written here in the book, is we have a tradition to light candles before Shabbat. We usher in Shabbat with candles, and the typical one is with 2 candles. And in the halacha, it gives a reason why do we light candles. So the practical meaning is, remember, until 100 years ago, there were no electric lights, and people had to light either candles or oil or kerosene or something to make light. And so the halacha says we should light lights before Shabbos, because if the house is dark, this is what it says, a husband will trip over something. He'll get mad at his wife because she left something out, and there will be no peace in the home. There'll be no peace in the home. If there's no peace in the home, there is no opportunity to be fruitful and multiply. So that's the reason that's brought in halacha. Now, of course, we have many, many spiritual reasons why it's beautiful to begin Shabbat with light. But the actual practical level is we want light in the house, so there'll be peace in the house. And when there's peace in the house, that peace will be fruitful and multiply. And so, again, to be fruitful and multiply equals 500. And the tradition is to light 2 candles. So the word for candle is ner. Ner equals 250. If you have 2 candles, it equals 500. And therefore, you have the 2 candles are representing Peru Uravu. So that's like a practical custom or law that comes from this connection with being fruitful and multiplying. Okay, as always, there's many, many, many more examples here in the book, but we only have so much time. So we'll end with a bracha like we always do. And the bracha is, we should all have peace in our homes. We should all have peace in our hearts.
It's Shlomo's yahrzeit.
Not his yahrzeit.
His birthday.
His birthday. Okay.
Lighting a candle.
Okay. My wife I have to show that they can see, is lighting a candle here, because starting now is Reb Shlomo's birthday, the 16th of Tevet. So this is his birthday. Okay. So here's the candle. I can, if you can see. So we put it right there, and we end with the blessing that we should all have peace in our hearts, peace in our home, peace between people, peace between nations. We should live to see it.